Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we're continuing my series on Chris Claremont's 54-issue run of the New Mutants and examining character growth and ideological evolution throughout that run. Today we're taking a look at Karma, aka Xi'an Manh, although it is worth noting the character's birth name was changed in recent years to more correctly reflect her Vietnamese origins. For the purposes of this video, I'll be referring to her solely as Karma from here on out though. But that does bring me to an important point I'd like to preface with. I can absolutely appreciate how in an era where mainstream comics rarely centered on marginalized voices, when Chris Claremont and Frank Miller introduced this character, to the best of my research, I believe this was Marvel's first Southeast Asian character. But we do have to acknowledge, like with the name, there are areas where Claremont sometimes falters with his more diverse characters because all of this is filtered through the lens of a white male writer in the 1980s. That's all to say, we have to acknowledge the good and the bad, Claremont's progressive attempts versus his dated flaws. And again, just to reemphasize, that's not to put Claremont down, he is my favorite comic book writer, but nobody is perfect, myself included. With that out of the way, let's start our deep dive into Karma, who does not appear in Marvel graphic novel number 4 as her initial first appearance, unlike many of the other New Mutants. Instead, she first debuts in Marvel Team Up number 100. Our introduction to Karma has a pretty horrific feeling to it. We first see her silhouetted, unidentified with glowing eyes, and she ambushes Spider-Man. And for those who don't know, Karma has the power to possess bodies. That is her mutant ability, and Claremont's prose emphasizes this violation as she attempts to take over Spider-Man, which is a very fascinating way to start this off because it positions her as a villain against Spider-Man, who's a character often portrayed as a paragon of morality and goodness. Now we will jump forward in the issue in order to take a step back to understand the context of why Karma is doing this and how it reflects her resilience and protective instincts. Karma is a product of the Vietnamese War, which for those who don't know the details of it, that was a brutal conflict between the US-backed South Vietnam and North Vietnamese Viet Cong. And I have to emphasize again, as we'll see, quite a brutal environment and one that certainly forged her into who she is. Karma's powers first manifested when during a Viet Cong raid on her village, a soldier aimed their gun at her twin brother Tran, and in that moment, her powers manifested as a trauma response, something we see fairly often with Claremont's characters, and we've seen before in the New Mutants, like with Sunspot when his powers ignited when he faced racial violence. Unlike Sunspot though, Karma's power is of possession and control. Karma stops the soldier but feels awful about stripping away that bodily autonomy even if it was from an enemy. This is her first instance of doing that and a part of her waning a bit because of it. And to her further horror, her brother Tran also possesses the same ability, which also manifests at that moment, but instead of just letting this Viet Cong soldier go, Tran makes him take his own life, laughing at it, feeling glorified in that moment. And already there is a split between these two siblings. Karma almost sees her power as a curse, while Tran immediately sees it as a weapon. Now Tran revealed his powers and Karma's powers to their uncle, who was already sort of known as a nefarious character. And eventually, the uncle secured evacuation out of Vietnam, but only for himself and Tran, leaving behind Karma, her parents, and her younger brother and sister. And for 3 years, they endured the intense stress and pain and starvation and persecution that went along with being in Vietnam at the time. Karma even notes that she had to use her powers sparingly, but only to survive, stealing food, manipulating guards, all for preservation and protection. And this is Claremont underlining her moral code here. She hates her abilities, she hates the utilization of them, and she only wields them out of necessity. Eventually her family is able to escape by boat and seemingly end their horrors, but unfortunately that is not the case because Thai pirates end up attacking them, slaughtering the men, which includes Karma's father, and assaulting the women as she she says, a fate worse than death for the women. Worth noting that her little brother is not killed here though. And to her dismay, at this time, Karma is so weak from malnutrition and extreme sickness that she does not fight back. She cannot fight back. She is not able to wield her abilities to save here. And shortly after this event, her mother dies from the excruciating trauma of this instance. Claremont is obviously pulling from real-world tragedy and putting a spotlight on the suffering of refugees. Once Karma and her siblings are finally rescued and brought to America, she is then brought to her uncle and Tran, where she learns that they have been building this criminal empire using Tran's powers. And her uncle makes the demand that she joins them, exploiting her abilities for profit as well. But she refuses this, taking her younger siblings and fleeing to a church for shelter, rejecting assimilation through corruption even if it means struggling with poverty. But eventually she starts to build a life. She gets a job, she gets an apartment, and she begins to become a parent to her younger siblings. This happiness, though, is short-lived and brings us basically up to date because her uncle ends up kidnapping her siblings. And with no allies on her side, having done everything she's been doing independently and making her own way in the world, Karma is forced to once again turn to her powers to save them, to protect them, to survive. And as harrowing as all of this is, the reason that she targets Spider-Man is kind of comedic. She sees a story from the Daily Bugle, a newspaper that we all probably know is super biased against Spider-Man, where it calls Spider-Man a menace. A layer here that may be unintended, may be intended also, is that the media's demonization of Spider-Man kind of represents her own dehumanization and demonization as a refugee in America, as there was a lot of xenophobia at this time because of that. But this is the reason that she possesses Spider-Man's body. She decides if she's going to use her powers, then she's going to use a villain to take down a villain. Unknown to her, Spider-Man is not a villain. What I do really like about this origin that I think is quite powerful is that Claremont focuses this story not really on her winning, but her enduring, tying that to broader socio-political themes like systemic abandonment and the struggle to rebuild. Now, once Karma has successfully hijacked Spider-Man's body, her first solo attempt at getting her siblings back fails, not only because she runs into the Fantastic Four, but also because her brother Tran, although having equal powers, is much more powerful than her at the time because he is well fed and well cared for, while she is poverty stricken in the US and struggling with her health to some degree because of that. After this though, the Fantastic Four along with Spider-Man are able to track down Karma, and that is where she reveals her origin story, which we just went over. And of course, they are all empathetic towards this, even Spider-Man, who was a victim of her power, who has now become one of her biggest advocates. All of this culminates in one final battle in this issue, where Karma, Spider-Man, and the Fantastic Four all go to confront her uncle and brother to save her younger siblings. And this is a pivotal scene that explores the cost of resilience, perhaps, and also just familial betrayal. And this is mostly a Spider-Man versus Fantastic Four fight, as Tran quickly possesses the Fantastic Four and has them work against Spidey, and that is just because, at the time especially, if you put Spider-Man in your book, he was going to sell, so there has to be the promise of Spider-Man also fighting in the book. But thankfully, we do get Karma being the one who saves the day here, and she pleads with her brother as this is going on, "For the love of all we hold sacred, stop this madness," highlighting their ideological divide at this point. Tran is fighting just for dominance and power. Karma is fighting for love and protection. And finally, Karma decides she has to put an end to this. She utilizes her powers to absorb her brother's essence, which is this profound act of moral and emotional labor where she takes in the good and the bad. And we get this superimposed yin-yang representation of this as she says, "He was the darkness, I am the light," highlighting though that she was going to win because her strength flowed from her soul. Karma absorbing her brother's soul like this is also framed as gentle and loving, really showcasing the bittersweet nature of this triumph over a family member. And again, she's not painted as a traditional hero here, though she is a force of good, but she embodies this painful truth that resilience often demands carrying the weight of those who've lost their way. This testament to unyielding strength within marginalized communities. And so she's finally reunited with her younger siblings, and that is our introduction to Karma. Now we'll take a look at Marvel graphic novel number 4, which introduces the rest of the team as well, and showcases Karma as our very first New Mutant. In this issue, we quickly learn that Reed Richards has sent Karma to the Xavier Institute, and we see Xavier and Moira examining her, studying her, trying to see if they can get a baseline on her powers. And again, we get the emphasis of her powers emerging from violence and not from choice, because when she is asked to demonstrate her abilities, she is hesitant towards it. She does not want to do it as we've seen before, but Moira does volunteer for it, and eventually she does it. And since Karma has now entered the life of Charles Xavier, and so too has Rain Sinclair, another New Mutant recently, Charles Xavier eventually is convinced to take on a second class of New Mutants. And with that, he also offers Karma a job opportunity, which is kind of vaguely, you can help me run the school and I'll pay you. But of course, she does accept this because this enables her to study under the tutelage of Charles Xavier and to also continue providing for her siblings. Another interesting utilization of Karma in this foundational issue is that we get to see the effects of her trauma a little bit more, both in the sense of just being extremely negative and also in the sense of positives that spawn from that tragedy. For example, when they're on their initial mission to basically go recruit Danny Moonstar, Karma is hit with some PTSD that is triggered by the gunfire and chaos. But we also see later on when Danny is injured, Karma is able to help because she has first aid knowledge from her lived experience. And she proves herself to be quite effective in taking down the Hellfire Club in this issue, Donald Pierce even stating that they've kind of clocked her as the most powerful member of the New Mutants. And our closing inner monologue of this issue from Karma states basically that this is not what she expected to happen to her, but if she can train here, if she can get good with her powers, and they can be of some benefit to humanity, then there's no doubt that that will be worth it. And now we can finally talk about the actual New Mutants ongoing series that was launched in the 80s, and interestingly enough, the very first scene we get in this first issue of the New Mutants is Danny accidentally using her powers to pull out Karma's memories of her father being slaughtered and her mother being abused. And we get a flash of the negativity of her brother perhaps embedded in her as she says, "If I could possess you, I'd have you rip the living heart from your own breast. I would make you suffer, but I can't let myself." Obviously, pretty hardcore threat at Danny for bringing back out that trauma and showing it to everyone, fair enough. In this aspect of her character, I feel like Claremont does set some stuff up initially, but there's not too much follow through with it. As you'll see, Karma really falls to the wayside here. I mean, early on, she was even positioned as the team leader really, being technically the oldest one, although the ages become pretty nebulous at some point, and we do even see her at certain points taking on the more mature, maternal role with some of the younger members of the team, like Roberto, for example. But there are also kind of built-in reasons for why she's not always around or as present in the story when she still is with the New Mutants, because she's been taking care of her younger siblings and she has to work, while the other New Mutants really just stay at the Institute. And this does affect the relationship dynamics between Karma and the rest of the team, as in this book she doesn't really develop as strong a friendship with the other New Mutants as some of them do with each other. I mean, it's hard to even put a circle or underline on who is the best friend of Karma in this run, because she's fairly neutral with them all. And now we are already at the point where we can talk about her first departure from the series, which happens very early on in issue number 6. So the basic plot is that Danny Moonstar has been kidnapped by Viper and Silver Samurai, and Karma, in her desperation to save her, turns to the only person she knows who may have the right information of the criminal underworld to actually save Danny. And that is her uncle. And when he refuses to give Karma the information that she needs to save her friend, she initially considers using her powers to torture him, putting him at the ledge of a building and saying she would just make him walk right off. Now, she doesn't allow herself to do that. She cannot cross that line and become the type of person that her brother was. But then on the flip side of that, in order to get the information, she does eventually agree that she would work for her uncle for 1 year, just as her brother did did. And I guess this would be sans the killing though, and just possessing people to advance the interests of her uncle and his criminal empire. But this is another one of those moments that reinforces her as the type of character who has such a deep love for her teammates and the idea behind it all that she is willing to make hard choices for their safety, even sacrificing herself. Now, once she gets the information and the team is able to go and infiltrate Viper's headquarters and rescue Danny, we do get a bit of a shocking turn here in the New Mutants ongoing series, where Viper's backup plan is just to blow up her headquarters, and she does do this, and it seems that the rest of the team escapes the explosion, but Karma is missing, presumed dead in this explosion, and the team goes on to mourn her loss. And then we do not see Karma again until issue 29 of the series. And she is drastically changed at this point because, as we learn, she has been taken over by the Shadow King, her autonomy stripped away from herself, and she is now hardly recognizable as Karma. She is absurdly much heavier than she was before because the Shadow King has had her body and has been indulging himself in all types of food and whatnot, I guess. And this is a classic little writing pitfall trope, I think, where it just becomes equating weight gain with corruption as the visual metaphor, which I think is very played out. The New Mutants, however, do eventually save Karma from the grasp of the Shadow King, although she is left in this oversized form, and laments about the weight and her image now, only encouraged by her team to keep moving forward because otherwise the Shadow King will have won. But Karma does quickly revert back to the old image of herself, as in the Asgardian Wars storyline. When the whole team gets separated, she ends up getting separated far alone in this desert environment. And in her current form, she wants to give up. She does not think she can make the trek through this desert, and she doesn't even know where she'd be going. But this continued theme of being a survivor and sacrificing for others, pulling them along with you, does continue here as she spots a little girl also out in this desert, and she becomes determined to protect her and help her find the exit too. It turns out though, Asgard is a strange place, the desert's a strange place. This little girl is a visage or hallucination or whatever it may be of a younger version of Karma. And once Karma has gone through the desert and she has shed away her fat, she's back in her sort of original body form. I know that seems to have happened quickly, but time works weird in Asgard, so I think that's the justification here. But at that point, the little girl is gone, and I like this moment a lot because it's kind of like the little girl was the embodiment of her selflessness. She doesn't fight for herself, she really always does it mostly for others, and that's why when she's at her lowest and she needs help, her self-conscious goes so far as to just manifest it as an image of herself so she can help that vulnerable child who is herself. Really interesting stuff. After this though, we don't really get much more from Karma during Claremont's run on the book. We do get a little bit of this mentality of what the Shadow King left behind on her though. For example, when Magneto takes over as headmaster of the school, she is resistant against that because she does not want to be, as she says, slave to another villain or bad guy, you know. But Karma kind of becomes a Where's Waldo character in a lot of these scenes and issues. I mean, you really have to search for her in the background because she's not doing much. They'll give her maybe a one-off line here and there, and even in the battles that they get into, her power is much less often utilized. And then unfortunately, what I would say is the last real instance of Karma in this run is during the Mutant Massacre event. In the aftermath of all that, her younger siblings are once again kidnapped. Their apartment is blown up, which is kind of this little fake out of Karma being exploded again. But all of this really just leads to her leaving Danny a note in Claremont's last issue of the run, saying that she's going to once again seek out her uncle for help in getting information on where her siblings are and not to follow her. So making an exit from the team right before Louise Simonson hops on board, and then we honestly don't see Karma as a character again for 2 real-life years once again. And to wrap up, while Karma's arc isn't the most coherent of the run, and while it's not the most present of the run, there are still many moments in it that I do like. I do think that her character is most successful successful in that Marvel team-up issue that is focused more on her, obviously, but seeing her slowly evolve from more stuck in the traumatized refugee to someone who has their own power and autonomy does give fragments of that rewarding feeling. I would have liked to see a little bit more of what they did touch on here and there, which was post-colonial survival ideology versus Xavier's idealism and how those two things coalesce, but on the other hand, that would have had to be handled a little more narratively in the forefront, I think, because otherwise I think it again just reduces us to doing a bunch of trauma tropes, which I certainly could see an argument for how that is a problem with this character too. Alright guys, thank you so much for checking out this video. If you have any thoughts on Karma and her progression through the New Mutants run, I would love to hear it. She's a pretty interesting character with a pretty fascinating power set. And with that, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and you all have a great rest of your day.